Welcome to the presentation of this Spring 2015 Structure and Function of the Human Body term project entitled As Above, So Below, an introductory evaluation of pathological anxiety. The content of this presentation is as enigmatic as the title itself. Therefore, to maintain conceptual continuity, I ask you to bear in mind as we proceed the principle of Carl Gustav Jung's statement, heaven above, heaven below, stars above, stars below. All that is above also is below. Grasp this and rejoice. The objectives of this presentation will be to establish a conceptual understanding of the pathogenic, discuss the manifestations of pathogenic anxiety, review the conceptual fundamentals of the human nervous system, form a conceptual understanding of anxiety by investigating the neurobiological and neuropsychological functions of stress responses, focusing particularly on the HPA axis and the VPNS, and ultimately develop an informed understanding of what pathological anxiety is and how its presentation impacts the organic systems of the human body that facilitate life. To begin, we must establish and understand some fundamental principles. Pathogens do not in and of themselves cause disease or disorder. Rather, the ultimate authentic cause of disease/disorder is the denaturing of molecular genetic material, which results in dysfunction, which systemically induces and/or facilitates the presentation of the symptoms by which we form the concept of disease or disorder. Therefore, the pathogen's role in all of this is simply to act as an effective catalyst to increase the probability of the presentation of those symptoms. Therefore, pathological anxiety is not in and of itself a disease or disorder. Rather, pathological anxiety is the characteristic and primary manifesting symptom of anxiety disorder. The fact is that understanding the symptoms of any disorder does help us to comprehend its nature. Anxiety disorder is a condition wherein a stress response is exhibited in an inappropriate or otherwise maladaptive manner. There are two primary routes by which the disorder is popularly conceived to be triggered and operate. The first is improper association and/or neural anatomical dysfunction. Fundamentally speaking, the two operate essentially the same, and the more that we are learning about the human nervous system, the more we are concluding that this is very much a chicken versus the egg situation. The term is also commonly used to describe a class of disorders, all of which are categorically oriented to the presentation of pathological anxiety. Some examples are panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, agoraphobia, obsessive-compulsive disorder, social phobia, etc. It's also worth noting that the only requirement for PTSD to develop is that the incident be sufficiently contextually traumatic that the memory of it is not properly integrated within the psyche / uploaded into the neural network. And that recent research is noting the presence of PTSD where it was not recognized before, and observing a positive causal association between the presence of childhood and adolescent PTSD and the presentation of a majority of mental, somatic, and visceral diseases and disorders. Because pathological anxiety is the typifying characteristic of anxiety disorders, the two terms may, for our purposes, be conceived of synonymously. However, that underlying principle of the distinction between a pathogen and disease or disorder should retain a place in your consciousness. We're now going to proceed to a quick review of the human nervous system. It is complex beyond our understanding. To effectively conceive of it and to, in any intelligible fashion, discuss it, we have to break it down into component categorical systems, which are often based off of function. However, it must be remembered that these are conceptual abstractions. There are 7 fundamental concepts which we must address before we can proceed any further. The first concept is the central nervous system, or CNS. It is constituted of the brain and brainstem, and that is the organs, tissues, cells which form the cerebral neural circuits, thus facilitating thought and neural processing. They're the primary building blocks of and interface with the neural network and mind/psyche. It also contains the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis, which we will discuss later. It is very important to the experience of a stress response. The second is the peripheral nervous system, which is also referred to as the PNS. It is constituted of the spinal cord and the diffuse nerves and neurons. They receive and transmit neural information to and from the CNS. The third is the autonomic nervous system, or ANS. It is also referred to as the visceral peripheral nervous system, or VPNS. As the latter name implies, this is the non-somatic efferent branch of the PNS. The fourth is sympathetic responses, which occur in the visceral peripheral nervous system and arouse the body for states of heightened activity, such as a stress response. The fifth concept is the neural circuitry. This is the organs, tissues, cells which form the universal neural network throughout the entire system, allowing for the relay and processing of information. The sixth concept is the neural network. This is the cumulative system of association within the neural circuits where neural processing, memory, thought, and learning occur. The neural network animates the CNS, thereby animating the PNS, thereby animating everything. Hence the title of our presentation, As Above, So Below. The final concept is the mind/psyche. For our purposes, we will define this as the qualitative distinguishing characteristic of the individual, which exists within the conceptual dimensional nexus of the neural network, the CNS, and the transcendental animating force, anima, soul, unknowable, unknown, what have you. We are now going to proceed to a discussion on what a fear, stress, anxiety response actually is, what we are experiencing. As has been implied, fear, anxiety are all subtypes of stress response. They are nuanced variations. There are distinctions. However, for our purposes, we are going to conceive of those distinctions as purely linguistic. Stress responses are completely natural and a healthy aspect of biology. They have developed as a means of protection. However, where their presentation is maladaptive, they are conceived of as pathogenic. The process of experiencing fear, anxiety, or stress response is extremely complex. However, the initial phase can be summarized as follows. The sensory organs perceive a stimuli. The neural circuitry, tissue of the PNS and CNS, relays electrochemical signals/neural impulses regarding the stimuli. This information is initially taken in and initial processing occurs at the basolateral amygdala, where the mind on some level perceives and associates the stimuli as a threat. The processed information, in this case the threat neural impulses, are relayed through the CNS from the basolateral amygdala to the HPA axis, specifically the central nucleus of the hypothalamus. The reception of the information in the impulses induces the HPA axis to cascade a systemic, coordinated, sympathetic reaction, or stress response, at which point we enter into the second phase, where in the HPA axis, what is above in the mind is transmuted into the body below. Here we are viewing a diagram of a mid-sagittally dissected HPA axis. There are therefore portions which are not visible. However, the areas we are focusing on, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, are quite clear. Here we are viewing a diagram of a mid-sagittally dissected HPA axis. There are therefore portions which are not visible. However, the areas we are focusing on, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, are quite clear. It should be noted that this process is not referring to the particular production of stress response inducing hormones. However, the fundamentals remain essentially the same. The information coded in the neural impulses come into the hypothalamus, where the neurosecretory cells produce hypothalamic releasing or inhibiting hormones. These hormones are secreted into a portal system, which relays them down to the posterior pituitary, where they induce or inhibit the production of their correspondent hormones within the anterior pituitary, where these hormones are then released into the bloodstream, where they will affect the cells, tissues, and glands that they are targeted for. The HPA axis is located in the brain and is composed of the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal gland. As the axis, they regulate via a feedback loop, among many things, stress responses. This is primarily accomplished by the number of glucocorticoid receptors located within the hypothalamus. When the hypothalamus receives particular threat neural impulses, it will release corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH. CRH induces the anterior pituitary gland to secrete cortisol. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid and one of the primary hormones which triggers a sympathetic response within the VPNS. This prepares the body for a heightened state of activity, decreasing the flow of blood to the digestive and urinary organs and increasing the flow to the respiratory organs and the large muscles. It also elevates heart rate and pressure and precipitates neurochemical changes which induce neuropsychological shifts. When the mind, on some level, perceives itself to be safe, via the hypothalamus, the cortisol production inhibitory process will be initiated. Eventually, this will result in the transition of the VPNS away from a sympathetic response and toward homeostasis. Essentially, a stress response can be conceived of as running your body in overdrive. It is a normal, healthy, and good thing. It provides the body with the needed modifications to extricate itself from a physically dangerous situation. It becomes pathogenic, and thus a disorder, when the stress responses are atypical to a detrimental degree. The reality is that long-term exposure to ongoing stress response can cause very serious damage. In the brain, sustained heightened exposure to cortisol can cause the glucocorticoid receptors of the hypothalamus to wither and die. This increases cumulative cortisol levels and generates longer, more intense systemic stress responses. Can also decrease the production of oxytocin and induces seizure activity, cerebral hemorrhage, aneurysm, and/or embolism, stroke development, and the development of other neurological, psychiatric, and psychological diseases and disorders. Outside of the brain, because of the systemic nature of the human body, long-term elevated stress responses increase the risk of at least CVD, hypertension, heart disease, organ deterioration, dysfunction, and eventual death. In conclusion, pathogens don't actually cause disease or disorder. Rather, they are induced by the inherent dysfunction caused by compromised and/or denatured molecular genetic material. Pathogens just increase the probability. Anxiety is a natural and healthy form of stress response. The mind, neural network, and CNS engage the HPA axis to induce a systemic sympathetic stress response. Anxiety only becomes pathogenic when its presentation is maladaptive. Pathological anxiety is a characteristic symptom of anxiety disorders, not a disorder in and of itself. Either by inappropriate or association and/or neuroanatomical dysfunction, the stress response is not inhibited and/or is triggered in a maladaptive manner. This stress response is typically moderated by the hypothalamus. However, long-term exposure denatures molecular genetic structure, resulting in dysfunction. Long-term effects of this on the body and psyche are incalculable. Thus, by evaluating pathological anxiety, the principle, as above so below, and the validity of this as the title for this subject is evidenced in the human person. But it must be remembered that as far down into hell as the roots may go, so too the branches rise into the heavens. As Jung said, I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become. We know that the mind and neural network is amazingly resilient, and that with the proper therapies, the wounds can be healed. This concludes my presentation. I'd like to take this time to thank you for your time, consideration, and the opportunity to study these materials.